The night before my son's retirement party, my housekeeper grabbed my arm in the kitchen and whispered, "Don't go upstairs, just stay here, something's wrong." I didn't understand. Margaret had been with our family for 23 years. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't exaggerate. If anything, she held things in too long. So I stayed, and 40 minutes later I heard everything. I'm really glad you're here with me today. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I love knowing how far these stories travel, and just so you know, some details in this story have been changed to protect privacy. Any resemblance to specific names or places is coincidental, but the message, every word of it, is real. My name is Helen. I'm 67 years old. I live in a white colonial on Birchwood Lane in Naperville, Illinois, the same house my late husband Richard and I bought in 1989 when the ink on our mortgage felt terrifying and the yard felt impossibly large. Richard died of a stroke 8 years ago. He was 61. We were supposed to grow old together in that house, watch grandchildren run through that yard, sit on that porch until neither of us could get up without help. Instead, I sat on that porch alone. I'm a retired physician. 32 years as a family practice doctor in DuPage County. I built a small clinic from nothing, Whitfield Family Medicine, started with 2 exam rooms and a receptionist named Carol who chewed peppermint gum constantly and knew every patient's birthday by heart. By the time I retired in 2021, we had 4 physicians, a nurse practitioner, 2 locations, and a patient base of nearly 9,000 people. I sold the practice to a regional health group for $4.3 million. That money, along with Richard's life insurance and the investments we'd built together over 4 decades, made up what our estate attorney called a substantial portfolio, a little over $6 million in total. Nothing extravagant by some standards. Everything by ours. I have one son, Daniel. He just turned 42. He's an electrical engineer, spent 15 years at a firm in Indianapolis before moving back to Naperville in 2019. He said he wanted to be closer to me after his father died. I believed him. I was grateful. I was lonely. He brought someone with him when he moved back, a woman named Kristen. Early 30s, sharp dresser, always smiling. She called it wealth management consulting, which I later understood to mean she helped wealthy people move their money around in ways that were technically legal but often weren't particularly honest. They got engaged in 2021, right after I sold the practice. I didn't think much about the timing then. I do now. The retirement party was Daniel's idea, not his retirement, mine. He wanted to celebrate the 3-year anniversary of my leaving medicine, which isn't something people typically celebrate, but Daniel said I'd never properly marked the occasion. He wanted to host a dinner at the Naperville Country Club. 50 guests, family, old colleagues, neighbors, friends going back 30 years. I said it was too much. He insisted. Said I deserved to be celebrated. I should have trusted my hesitation. The party was scheduled for Saturday evening. This was Friday. Margaret was in the kitchen making her chicken tortilla soup. She made it every Friday, had for years, and the smell of it had come to feel like safety itself. I was at the kitchen table going through some mail when my estate attorney, a woman named Joan Sharp, called my cell phone. I almost didn't answer. It was nearly 7 in the evening. "Helen," she said before I could speak, "I need you to listen carefully and stay calm." My stomach dropped. Joan had called me that morning, twice actually, and I'd assumed it was about routine paperwork related to a charitable trust I'd been setting up in Richard's name, the Richard Whitfield Memorial Scholarship at Naperville North. $20,000 a year to a graduating senior going into healthcare. It was the thing I was most proud of since retirement. "I received a document today," Joan said. "A power of attorney amendment. It came through my office as a filing request. Helen, your signature is on it. But I don't remember preparing this document, and I don't believe you signed it." I didn't say anything. The amendment would transfer full financial and medical decision-making authority to Daniel and Kristen, jointly, in the event that 2 licensed physicians certify cognitive impairment. It would also give them immediate authority over the scholarship trust, your investment accounts, and the proceeds from the practice sale. My hand was on the kitchen table. I pressed it flat, as if I needed to feel something solid. "Who filed it?" I asked. "The filing came from an estate planning firm I've never worked with, Garrett and Associates, Chicago. I've been trying to reach them all afternoon. The office went to voicemail." She paused. "Helen, there's a physician listed as one of the certifying parties, a Dr. Philip Rosen." Dr. Philip Rosen. Philip Rosen had been my personal physician for 4 years. I thanked Joan. I told her I would call her back. I put the phone down on the table. Margaret looked at me from across the kitchen. She'd stopped stirring. "Miss Helen," she said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you too." She set down the wooden spoon. She wiped her hands on a dish towel. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, and I noticed her hands were trembling slightly. "She told me that earlier that afternoon, while I was at my book club, Daniel and Kristen had come to the house. They had a key. I'd given Daniel one when he moved back to Naperville. They didn't know Margaret was there. She'd been in the laundry room off the back hallway when she heard them come in. She heard them go upstairs to Richard's old study. She said she went to the hallway and stood still because something felt wrong. She could hear their voices through the study door. Not every word, but enough. Enough to hear Daniel say the certification needs to happen before the party, so everything's in place by Monday. Enough to hear Kristen say the Chicago account is ready. We just need both signatures on the transfer once authority shifts. Enough to hear Daniel say Mum won't fight it. She trusts Rosen completely. Margaret looked at me across the kitchen table. Her eyes were wet. "I didn't know what to do," she said. "I didn't know if I should call you, or if I was misunderstanding something, or you're not misunderstanding anything," I said. I sat very still for a moment. The soup was simmering on the stove. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the dark. I asked Margaret if she knew whether Daniel and Kristen had taken anything from the study. She said she thought Kristen had been at Richard's old desk, where I kept my personal files in the bottom drawer. She wasn't sure. I went upstairs. The study was exactly as I'd left it, or nearly so, but the bottom drawer of Richard's desk was slightly open. I always closed it completely. I was meticulous about that, because Richard had been meticulous about it. And after he died, I kept the habit the way you keep, the habits of someone you've lost, without knowing why, just because stopping feels like another small erasure. My file folders were there, but the one labeled Estate Current Documents was thinner than it should have been. I went back downstairs. I poured myself a glass of water I didn't drink. Then I called Joan back and told her everything Margaret had told me. Joan was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Helen, you need to come to my office tonight. Bring Margaret." We were there by 8:30. Joan's office is on Washington Street in downtown Naperville, a 4-story building, glass and brick, the kind that looks corporate but feels human on the inside because Joan has photographs of her 3 daughters on every surface and a bowl of wrapped caramels on the edge of her desk. I'd been sitting in that chair across from her for 12 years. Tonight neither of us touched the caramels. Joan walked me through the document she'd received. The amendment was 2 pages. My signature was on page 2, and it was my signature, or close enough that I couldn't immediately say it wasn't. But Joan pointed out the date beneath it, March 14th. She pulled up her calendar. March 14th was the day she and I had met at this exact office to finalize the scholarship trust paperwork. I had signed 7 documents that day. She had copies of all 7. My theory, Joan said, is that one of those signature pages was photographed or scanned and used to create a fake document around it. It's not unheard of. It requires access to the originals or very good copies. Daniel had been at the house in March. He'd helped me move some furniture in Richard's study. He'd been alone in that room for at least 20 minutes. I thought about that. I pressed it down because I needed to keep thinking clearly. What does the amendment actually do? I asked. Even though Joan had already explained it, I needed to hear it again. Once 2 physicians certify cognitive impairment, and the document names Dr. Rosen as one of them, full control transfers to Daniel and Kristen jointly, no court proceeding, no independent review. It would happen administratively, essentially overnight. She paused. Combined with whatever transferred documents they've apparently already prepared, Helen, you could lose full access to your accounts within 72 hours of Monday. I did the math. $6.1 million. The scholarship. The house. Everything Richard and I had built. Everything I had spent 30 years earning one 15-minute appointment at a time. Can we stop it? I asked. Yes, Joan said, but we need to move quickly, and I need to know, how much do you trust your son? I had been asking myself that question since I walked out of Richard's study and found the drawer open. I didn't answer right away. I thought about Daniel, at 7 years old, falling off his bike on the driveway and refusing to cry until he saw my face, and then crying for 10 minutes straight. I thought about him at 20, calling me from his college dorm at 2 in the morning because he'd failed an exam and was convinced his life was over. I thought about him at 35, sitting beside me in the hospital waiting room the night Richard died, not saying anything, just sitting there with his shoulder pressed against mine. I thought about how much time had passed since then, how much of it I'd spent at my desk, in exam rooms, managing the practice sale, setting up the scholarship, how many phone calls I'd let go to voicemail because I was tired, how many dinners we'd rescheduled. I don't know anymore, I said. Joan nodded like that was the honest answer she'd expected. She had someone she wanted me to call, a man named Frank DeLuca, former IRS investigator, now private. She'd worked with him twice before, both times in financial fraud cases. He's not cheap, she said, and he's not warm, but he's thorough and he doesn't make mistakes. I called him from Joan's office at 9:15. He picked up on the second ring. I told him everything. He asked 3 questions, wrote down Joan's contact information, and said he'd have preliminary findings by morning. I drove home in the dark. Margaret had waited up. She'd left the soup on low and the kitchen light on, and when I came through the door she just looked at me, and I thought about the fact that this woman, who was not family, who had no obligation to me beyond what I paid her, had sat in my laundry room and listened and worried and waited to tell me the truth. I hugged her. She held on. "Get some sleep," she said. I didn't sleep. I lay in the room Richard and I had shared for 30 years and stared at the ceiling and thought about the retirement party tomorrow evening. 50 people. The country club. Daniel standing up to give a toast about his mother who had given everything to her community. And somewhere in that room, if I didn't stop it, documents that would strip me of everything. At 6:40 in the morning, Frank DeLuca called. "I've got 3 things," he said. "You need to hear all of them." I sat up. "Go ahead." "The firm on the document, Garrett and Associates. It's a shell, incorporated in Delaware, no website, 1 registered agent, no licensed attorneys on file with the Illinois bar. It was created in January of this year." I closed my eyes. "Okay. The Chicago account your son mentioned, I traced a related LLC, Whitfield Legacy Partners, filed March 3rd in Nevada. 2 members, Daniel Whitfield and Kristen Ames. The operating agreement includes language that would allow them to receive and distribute funds from a family estate in the event of an incapacity determination. They had incorporated a company specifically to receive my money. 3 weeks before my attorney received the fraudulent amendment. "And the 3rd thing?" I asked. Frank paused. Not for effect. He was the kind of man who paused because he was being careful. "Dr. Philip Rosen," he said. "I ran a background on him. In 2019, he was named in a civil lawsuit in Cook County. A patient's family alleged he had certified a false diagnosis of dementia to enable a conservatorship transfer. The case was settled out of court. Records are partially sealed, but the payout was $340,000. I sat on the edge of my bed. The morning light was coming through the curtains, the same curtains Richard and I had picked out at a store in Geneva 20 years ago, pale blue, the color of early sky. Philip Rosen had done this before. He had sat across from me in his exam room and asked about my sleep and my diet, and listened to my heart with his stethoscope, and he had already done this to someone else. I thought about that person, whether they'd lost everything, whether anyone had helped them in time. "Frank," I said, "can you get documentation on the 2019 case?" "Working on it," he said. "I'll have everything compiled by noon. Where do you want to meet?" I gave him Joan's office address. I called Joan next and told her what Frank had found. She was silent for a moment, then said, "Helen, we can stop this, but I need to know what you want to do about the party." I hadn't decided yet, but I was close. By noon, I was sitting at Joan's conference table with Frank, Joan, and 2 other people I'd called that morning. The first was my neighbor and oldest friend, Patricia Coombs, a retired county judge, 69 years old, white-haired, unflappable. She'd had dinner at my table 400 times. She and Richard had argued about baseball and local politics for years, and after he died she started coming over every Sunday just to sit with me. The second person was my former office manager, Gloria Reyes, 48, meticulous, had managed Whitfield Family Medicine for 19 years and knew the name, birthday, and complete medical history of every patient we'd ever had. She'd also quietly been keeping her own file on some irregularities she'd noticed in my financial accounts over the past 6 months. Things she hadn't wanted to bother me with until she was sure. She was sure now. Gloria spread her folder open on the table. 3 transfers from my personal account, each between $8,000 and $9,500, each one just under the federal reporting threshold. The transfers had gone to an account she traced to Kristen Ames. They'd started in September, 2 months after Daniel and Kristen had offered to help me manage my bills after I mentioned I'd been feeling overwhelmed by paperwork. I had given them access to one account for bill payment purposes. They had used it for this. Gloria looked at me carefully. "I should have told you sooner. I kept thinking I was misreading it." "You're telling me now," I said. Frank laid out his 3 folders on the table. He'd color-coded them. I noticed that and found it almost darkly funny, the same way the evidence in the video I was living had been divided into red, blue, black. Mine were manila, green, and red. The manila folder, the fraudulent amendment, the shell firm, the signatures, the timeline, the green folder, Whitfield Legacy Partners, the Nevada LLC, the operating agreement, 3 months of account transfers, the red folder, Philip Rosen, the 2019 case, a deposition excerpt Frank had obtained through a contact at the Cook County Clerk's office, the name of the original victim, a 74-year-old woman named Edith Carmichael from Evanston. Her son had initiated the conservatorship. He had paid Rosen $60,000. Edith had lost $1.9 million and spent 14 months in a memory care facility before her granddaughter, an attorney, got a court to review the original certification and overturn it. Edith was still alive. She was 80 in December. Frank had spoken to her granddaughter that morning. She was willing to participate, whatever form that needed to take. Patricia had been reading everything in silence. She looked up. "Here's what we can do," she said. "I know Judge Roy Anselm in Chancery. He owes me nothing, but he's fair and he's fast. Emergency petition to freeze your accounts and void the fraudulent amendment. We filed today, sealed, effective midnight. That stops any Monday transfer before it can execute. Simultaneously, you file a complaint with the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation against Rosen, and we refer the forged document to the DuPage County State's Attorney." "How long does this take?" I asked. "If I call Roy right now, the freeze order is in place before the party starts." I looked at the red folder, at Edith Carmichael's name. "Patricia," I said, "if we do this quietly, just the freeze, just the complaint, does Rosen face any real consequence?" She met my eyes. "Probably not immediately. These things take time. The board is slow. And if Daniel and Kristen aren't arrested, they get to walk away and wait. And if we do it publicly—" She was quiet for a moment. "Then we give the state's attorney something they can move on quickly. And we make it impossible for Rosen to do this to a fourth patient. A fourth." Which meant there had been a third besides Edith, one I didn't know about yet. I closed the red folder. I thought about 50 people gathering at the Naperville Country Club in 7 hours. I thought about my colleagues who had worked beside me for 3 decades. I thought about Daniel standing at a microphone, telling the room how proud he was of his mother. I thought about Edith Carmichael. I made my decision. "Here's what we're going to do," I said. The party was elegant. I'll give Daniel that. The country club's main dining room was set with cream linens and low floral arrangements, white dahlias, my favorite, and whoever had arranged the seating had put my closest friends near the front. Old colleagues from the clinic, neighbors from Birchwood Lane, a few former patients I'd become close to over the years. I wore a deep blue dress. Richard had always said blue suited me. I smiled when I walked in. I hugged people. I accepted glasses of champagne I didn't drink. Daniel was there at the entrance with Kristen, both of them welcoming guests, perfectly warm, perfectly poised. Kristen's dress was pale green. She hugged me when she saw me and said, "You look beautiful, Helen. Tonight is going to be wonderful." "I think so too," I said. Dr. Mike Rosen arrived at 6:50. He found me near the bar and shook my hand and said I looked well. I thanked him. I watched his eyes. They were perfectly ordinary. He was very good at this. Daniel had arranged the program. Dinner first, then remarks. He would speak, then 2 of my former colleagues. Then he'd invite me to say a few words. "Simple," he'd said. "Just celebrating you." Dinner passed. The room was warm. Gloria sat at a table near the back. Patricia sat 2 tables from the front. Frank was near the exit, jacket and tie, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching everything. At 8:15, Daniel took the microphone. He was a good speaker. He always had been. He talked about watching me leave for the clinic before sunrise. He talked about sitting in the waiting room as a kid when the babysitter cancelled, doing his homework on a plastic chair while I finished with the last patient. He talked about how I had never once, in 32 years, made my work feel like a burden. The room was quiet and attentive. A few people dabbed at their eyes. I watched his face while he spoke, and I tried to find the child who had cried on the driveway after falling off his bicycle. He was there somewhere. I knew he was. But so was everything else. He raised his glass. "To my mother," he said, "who gave everything to this community, we are so proud of you." 50 people raised their glasses. I smiled. And then the room host stepped toward me and offered me the microphone, and I walked to the front of the room. I looked out at the faces, people who had trusted me with their blood pressure readings and their diagnoses and their fears at 2 in the morning, when something felt wrong and they didn't know who else to call. People who had known Richard. People who had watched me survive losing him. "Thank you," I said. 32 years is a long time to do anything, and I didn't do it alone. I looked at Gloria. She gave the smallest nod. "I've been thinking this week about what it means to build something. A practice, a home, a marriage, a life. Richard and I built ours together for 34 years. When he died, I kept building. Not because I didn't grieve, I did, but because the work was how I stayed connected to who we were, to what mattered." The room was very still. 8 years later, I still feel him in this community, in the patients I treated, in the scholarship we established at Naperville North in his name, in this house. I paused. In everything we protected together. I let that word sit for just a moment. Protected. This week I learned that something I built was in danger. My voice stayed steady, and I learned it from someone who had no obligation to help me, but did anyway. So before I say anything else, I want to acknowledge Margaret Kelsey, who has kept my home and my confidence for 23 years, and who told me the truth when it would have been much easier to stay quiet. Margaret was near the back, near the kitchen entrance. She hadn't expected to be named. She looked at the floor, then up at me, and pressed her hand over her heart. I also want to acknowledge Joan Sharp, my estate attorney, who called me on a Friday evening because she knew something was wrong, and Patricia Coombs, who spent 30 years on the bench in this county, and Gloria Reyes, who ran Whitfield Family Medicine better than I ever could, and who noticed what I missed. People were exchanging glances now. The warmth in the room had shifted into something more uncertain. Daniel was watching me. He had gone very still. "There is a document," I said, "a power of attorney amendment. My signature appears on it. I did not sign it." Silence. The document was filed by a firm that does not legally exist. It was designed to transfer full authority over my finances and medical decisions to 2 people, effective Monday, without any court review, any independent verification, or my knowledge. I looked at Daniel. He looked back at me. "I want to tell you," I said, "what I found when I started asking questions." Frank pressed a button at the AV station near the back wall. A screen lowered behind me. I turned to look at it, then turned back to the room. "This is a Nevada LLC called Whitfield Legacy Partners. It was incorporated on March 3rd of this year. Its 2 members are listed here. The names appeared on the screen. Daniel's name. Kristen's name. The operating agreement language about incapacity and estate funds. Someone at a table near the middle said something under their breath. A woman touched her husband's arm. Daniel stood up. "Momo, please sit down, Daniel." He sat. "The purpose of this company," I continued, "was to receive my assets following an incapacity certification. The certification was to be provided by a physician I have trusted for 4 years." The next slide showed Philip Rosen's name, his license number, and a summary of the 2019 Cook County civil case. I didn't read it aloud. I let people read it. Dr. Rosen was at a table to my right. He stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. He began walking toward the side exit. "Dr. Rosen," I said. My voice didn't waver. "You've done this before. Once that we know of. There may be others." He stopped. He turned. For one moment we looked at each other across that room. My doctor, a man who had listened to my heart with a stethoscope and discussed my health and built my trust. And his face did something complicated that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite defiance. Then he looked at the door. 2 men in plain clothes stepped from near the exit to block it. They had been seated as guests for the past 2 hours. I turned back to the room. "I want you to hear the name Edith Carmichael," I said. "She is 79 years old. She lives in Evanston. In 2019, she lost $1.9 million. She spent 14 months in a memory care facility she didn't need. She was there because someone filed paperwork that said she was cognitively impaired, and the physician who signed that paperwork is the same man who was planning to sign mine on Monday." From the back of the room, a video connection opened on the screen. Edith Carmichael sat in a bright living room, white hair, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Her granddaughter sat just off camera. "My name is Edith Carmichael," she said, "and I am telling you this because I almost didn't get the chance. My granddaughter saved me. Tonight, Helen Whitfield is saving herself, and I hope that what happens here saves someone else too." The room was absolutely quiet. Kristen stood abruptly and moved toward the main entrance. "The accounts are already frozen," I said without turning away from the room. "As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, emergency order from Judge Roy Anselm in Chancery. The fraudulent amendment has been voided. The state's attorney's office received our filing at 6 p.m. I watched Kristen stop. I watched her stand very still. "Dr. Philip Rosen," I said, "you are facing a formal complaint with the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, a referral to the DuPage County State's Attorney, and a civil suit from Edith Carmichael's estate. The officers near the exit have paperwork for you." One of the plain-clothes officers crossed the room toward Rosen. I looked at my son. Daniel was sitting with his hands on the table, his eyes on me. He looked younger than 42. He looked like a boy who had made a terrible calculation and was now sitting with the consequences of it. I had spent the afternoon going back and forth about this moment, about whether to let him sit there or call him out by name, about whether the public nature of this served justice or just served my anger. In the end, I said only this: my son will be interviewed by the state's attorney's office next week. I will not characterize tonight what his involvement was or wasn't. That is what investigations are for. Daniel closed his eyes. I set the microphone back in its stand. I stepped away from the front of the room. The rest of the evening passed, the way things pass after something irrevocable, in fragments. The officers led Rosen out through the side exit. Kristen sat back down, pale, and said nothing to anyone. 2 of my colleagues from the clinic came and hugged me without speaking. Patricia touched my shoulder and said, "You did it right." Gloria pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. and I put it in my pocket without reading it. At 10 o'clock, most of the guests had gone. The staff was clearing tables. I was sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, when Daniel came and sat across from me. He didn't speak right away. I waited. "I need you to know," he said, "that I didn't think. I told myself it was just protection, that you were getting older and you didn't need to manage all of it, and Kristen knew how to structure it, and Daniel." He stopped. "I know what you told yourself," I said. "I spent the night asking whether I could have seen it coming, whether I'd missed something. And then I stopped asking that, because the question that matters now isn't what I missed. It's what you chose." He was quiet for a long time. "I want to explain," he finally said. "You'll have the chance," I said. "In the right setting, with the right people present. Not tonight." I stood. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. I looked at my son, this person I had brought into the world and fed and worried over and been so proud of, this person who had sat beside me in a waiting room the night his father died and pressed his shoulder against mine, and I felt something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite fury. It was something flatter and colder and more permanent. "I love you," I said. "That isn't changing, but something else has too." I walked out. The autumn air was cold and clean. My car was in the lot. I sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine, the way you do when you've just come through something and you're not sure the world still has the same dimensions it had before. Then I drove home. Margaret was in the kitchen. She'd made tea. She set a mug in front of me without asking and sat down across the table. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. 6 months passed. The Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation revoked Philip Rosen's medical license in February. The state's attorney's office filed criminal charges in March. 2 counts of fraud. 1 count of conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. He pled not guilty. A trial date was set for the following autumn. Edith Carmichael's civil suit was consolidated with mine. 2 other women came forward after the local press covered the case. Both were over 70. Both had been Rosen's patients. One had lost her home. Kristen Ames was charged separately. Wire fraud, conspiracy, unauthorized use of financial accounts. She negotiated a plea in April, 18 months, reduced to probation given cooperation. She gave the state's attorney everything. Daniel was not charged. The evidence showed that he had known the LLC existed, had signed the operating agreement, and had been present for at least 2 conversations about the fraudulent amendment. But Kristen's cooperation and Daniel's own statement established that he had not understood or had refused to understand the full scope of what he was participating in. I'm not sure, even now, which of those is true. His attorney arranged for him to repay the money that had been transferred from my bill payment account, $26,500 in total. The repayment cleared in January. He sent a cashier's check. No note. In February, he sent a letter. I read it on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table with my coffee. 5 pages, handwritten on plain paper, the kind you buy in a pack at a drugstore. His handwriting was the same as it had been when he was 12 years old, slightly cramped, slightly tilted to the right. He wrote about Kristen, about how she had come into his life when he was afraid, when he was 40 and had moved back to Naperville and was quietly panicking about where his life was going. He wrote that she'd made everything feel manageable and organized, and that when she brought up the estate planning, she'd made it sound so reasonable, so careful. He wrote, "I convinced myself it was protection. I want you to know that I knew it wasn't, somewhere underneath. And that's the part I have to live with. He wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, that he understood if I needed to stay away from him, that he was seeing a therapist twice a week, and that the hardest sessions were the ones where he had to talk about Dad, about what it meant to lose Richard and then slowly lose me too, not to death but to the distance that had grown between us without either of us naming it. He wrote, "I think I was angry at you for surviving, for keeping going. You always kept going, Mum. Sometimes it felt like there was no room for anything to be wrong." I read that line 3 times. I set the letter down. I looked out the kitchen window. The backyard was bare. February in Illinois is its own particular kind of grey, but the maple tree Richard had planted the year Daniel was born was still there, branches reaching up into the pale sky. I thought about all the Saturdays I'd spent at the clinic when Daniel was small, all the dinners that ran late, all the mornings I left before he woke up, all the times I said we'll talk this weekend, and then the weekend filled itself with other things. I had spent 32 years making sure other families were cared for. I had done that with my whole heart, but a whole heart can still be in the wrong room. I wrote back 2 weeks later. I said, "Daniel, I am not ready to see you, but I am not done with you either. Give me time." In April, I restructured everything with Joan. New estate plan, independent trustees for the scholarship fund, a durable power of attorney held by Patricia, a financial advisor of my own choosing, a woman named Laura Kim, 45, recommended by Gloria, with 20 years of experience and no connection to anyone in my family. I also did something I hadn't expected. I called Edith Carmichael. Not about the lawsuit, just to talk. She answered on the 3rd ring, and we spoke for an hour and 15 minutes. She was funny. She'd been a schoolteacher for 40 years in Evanston. She had 6 grandchildren. She still gardened, though her knees gave her trouble in cold weather. She said her granddaughter called every single day, even if just for 5 minutes. At the end of the call she said, "Thank you for standing up. I stood up too late. Mine was already done by the time anyone believed me." I said, "It wasn't too late. You're here." "I am," she said, and she laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and surprised. We've talked every month since. A year after the retirement party that I never actually celebrated, I sat on the porch on Birchwood Lane in the October sun. The yard was full of leaves. The maple was orange and gold. Joan had finalized the Richard Whitfield Memorial Scholarship renewal the week before. $20,000 going to a girl from Naperville North who wanted to be a pediatric nurse. Richard would have liked that. I had a voicemail from Daniel. He'd left it 2 days earlier. He said he was in Chicago now. A new engineering position. A small apartment in Lincoln Park. He said he'd been sober for 4 months. I hadn't known he'd been drinking, and that he was doing the work. He said he wasn't asking for anything. He just wanted me to know. I hadn't called back yet, but I hadn't deleted the message either. There's a thing about losing someone you love, and I mean slowly, by distance and by choices and by all the small failures of attention that accumulate over years, that is different from losing them all at once. When Richard died, I knew the shape of the grief immediately. It was enormous, but it had edges. This doesn't have edges. But I've learned something. In the year since that October night at the country club, in the months of legal proceedings and depositions and the long work of rebuilding what had been shaken, I've learned that protecting yourself is not the same as closing yourself. That justice and forgiveness are not opponents. That the people who save you are often the ones with no formal obligation to do so. A housekeeper who could have stayed quiet, a judge friend who cancelled her Sunday to file an emergency petition, a 79-year-old woman in Evanston who answered a phone call from a stranger. I made a mistake too, not the trusting of the wrong people. That happens, and it is not a moral failure to believe in someone. My mistake was the distance, the absence, the gap I let grow in the one relationship I had convinced myself would always hold. Margaret came out on the porch with 2 cups of tea. She set one beside me and lowered herself into the other chair. "It's a nice afternoon," she said. It was. The maple tree held its color. A neighbor's kid rode a bike down the sidewalk very slowly, the way kids do when they're just learning how to balance. I thought about calling Daniel back. I thought I might. Not today. But soon. If you stayed with me all the way to this moment, I want to hear from you. What would you have done? Not in the moment at the podium. I think most of us know the answer to that. But after. When the papers are filed and the case is moving and the person who hurt you is also the person you raised, what do you do with that? I'm still figuring it out. I'd love to know if you are too. If this story gave you something to think about, I hope you'll subscribe so you don't miss what I share next. And if someone in your life is handling something like this alone, send this to them. Nobody should have to figure it out in silence. Thank you for being here, I mean that. I've thought about cause and effect a lot since that October evening at the country club. Not in any abstract way, I mean the very specific, very personal chain of it. Every choice I made over 67 years led to that room. And every choice Daniel made led him there too. I built a practice on careful observation. 32 years of listening to what people weren't saying, noticing what they were hiding behind the words they chose. I was good at it with strangers. I was not good at it with my son. I looked at Daniel, and I saw what I wanted to see. A man who'd come home, who was close by, who cared. I didn't ask harder questions because I didn't want harder answers. That's not wisdom. That's comfort dressed up as trust. And Kristen found that gap and walked straight through it. I don't say that to excuse Daniel. He made choices. He signed documents. He stood in my kitchen and smiled at me, knowing what was being prepared. Whatever Kristen offered him, security, purpose, a plan that felt like control, he accepted it, and the accepting was his. But I have to be honest with myself about the distance I created, the Saturdays I spent at the clinic when he was 12 years old, the dinners I rescheduled, the calls I let go to voicemail because I was tired. I told myself the work was for the family, but at some point the work became the priority, and the family became the reason I told myself I was doing the work. There's a difference. I missed it for years. What Margaret did took a kind of courage I hadn't thought to ask for from anyone. She had every reason to stay quiet, to decide it wasn't her place, to convince herself she'd misheard, to keep her job and her routine and her peace. Instead, she sat across from me at my own kitchen table, hands trembling, and told me the truth. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing, actually. The whole reason I'm sitting on my porch a year later with the scholarship renewed, and my accounts intact, and my name still on the house Richard and I chose together. The people who saved me were the ones with no formal obligation to do so. Margaret, Joan, who called on a Friday evening because something felt wrong. Patricia, who spent her Sunday filing an emergency petition instead of resting. Gloria, who kept a folder for 6 months because she cared more about me than about staying comfortable. And Edith Carmichael, who answered a phone call from a stranger and said, "Yes, I'll speak," because she understood that silence is how this keeps happening. I fought a lot about what I would tell someone who is where I was the night before that party, sitting at a kitchen table with cold tea and a phone call that just changed everything. Here is what I know. Your first instinct is to protect the people who hurt you. That instinct is not weakness. It's love, and it's real. But protecting them from consequences is not the same as protecting them. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do for someone you love is let the truth be the truth. Resilience isn't the absence of pain. It's the decision to keep your eyes open anyway, to look at what's actually in front of you, not what you wish were there. I haven't spoken to Daniel yet, but I haven't stopped thinking about him either. Both of those things are true at the same time. I think that's where I'm supposed to be right now. Not rushing toward forgiveness, not hardening into bitterness, just sitting with the complicated reality of a relationship that matters and is broken and may, with time and honesty and work, become something worth keeping. I'm 67 years old. I know what it costs to lose people. I also know what it costs to keep ones who are hurting you. Neither is easy. Both require you to be honest about what you actually want, not what looks right from the outside, not what's easier in the short run, but what you can live with when you're sitting alone on a porch in October watching a maple tree your husband planted 30 years ago. I'm still figuring out the answer. But I'm asking the right question now. That's more than I could say a year ago.